Hello and welcome to Kitchen Sink Dharma. So the title of today's talk is Clinging in the Rain, and before I go any further I should probably apologise now for the bad pun. It's actually been raining quite a lot here over the summer, and it made me think about how we react when it rains. How do we react? What do we call it? Horrible weather, a nasty day. I know I use language like that sometimes. And wet weather is a great example of something over which we've got absolutely no control. If it's raining whether we like it or not. But we can feel cheated, especially if we were expecting sunshine or if we had plans. Cling to the idea that the weather's wrong, that somehow it's a mistake, it's not fair. We can even take it personally. And this is a trivial example, but I think it illustrates something quite important. And there's a word in Pali, which is the ancient language that the Buddhist teachings were first written down in. And it's upadana. I think it's the same word in Sanskrit as well. And upadana is commonly translated as attachment. But I don't think that's a particularly good translation of it, and I'll tell you why in a moment. So Buddhist teachers often talk about attachment as a bad thing. And we're supposed to practice detachment. And if we can develop our capacity for detachment, we'll achieve peace and happiness. And I've got a problem with the idea that detachment is what we're actually trying to achieve. Because when we talk about being detached, what comes up for me is separation. It's this idea that we should just float around independent of everyone and everything around us. And also, if we're cultivating detachment, that really suggests that things like close relationships are not a good thing, that you shouldn't really love your partner or your children or your friends, because that would mean getting too attached. And all of that sounds a bit cultish to me. And not only that, it also ignores basic human psychology, because we're relational creatures. Also in modern psychology, the word attachment is used to describe a healthy bond. So a child's attachment with a parent or a carer is important for their development. And humans are hardwired to seek closeness and to maintain closeness. So in that context, healthy attachment is very much seen as a good thing. So today I'm not going to try and tell you to stop being so attached. And instead I'm going to suggest that maybe a better translation for the word upadana might be clinging or grasping, or we could even use the word reactivity. So in developmental psychology, clinging means something very different from attachment. Attachment suggests a secure bond, and clinging suggests the opposite. It suggests an insecure form of attachment. And clinging is what I'm talking about today. So if you imagine a rope passing through your hands, and if you try and cling to it, you get rope burns. That's what I mean by clinging. So loving relationships with the people around you are not the problem. And I'm not aware of anything within Buddhist teachings that says otherwise. What can be a problem is needing those people to be a particular way, needing them to conform to your expectations, and clinging to an idea of how they should be. So as Thich Nhat Hanh said, you must love in such a way that the person you love feels free. And I want to emphasize how love and clinging are two very, very different things. So in Buddhism, there's a strong emphasis on boundless love. We're encouraged to cultivate affection for all beings. But teachings on boundless love don't diminish your love for the people who are closest to you. And sometimes in Buddhist teachings, it feels like we're being asked to love everyone equally. Like we have to sign up to loving kindness for all beings on day one. And teachings on bodhicitta, which is the idea of the awakened heart, can feel quite extravagant in their aims. Quite grandiose, this idea of love without limits. And they can leave us asking, is it okay to love some people more than others? Am I allowed to do that? Am I supposed to just love everyone as much as I love my kids or my partner or my family or my closest friends? And I think it's important to remember that teachings on boundless love and loving kindness for all beings and things like that shouldn't actually be a stick to hit ourselves with. So instead we can see them as a leaning, if you like, an orientation, a direction of travel. we can start small and then begin to soften the heart and gradually widen our circle of concern. So we start to say, you're part of me, I'm going to let some of your story in. But in our own time, I don't think it can be forced. So back to the word upadana. So that's more like the closing down, the tightening up. It's kind of the disconnection, if anything. And I think using an unfamiliar word like upadana can actually sometimes be helpful. Because, a word in a different language, an ancient language, can actually encourage beginner's mind rather than pushing us into preconceptions that we have around words like attachment. And the word upadana actually literally means adding fuel to the fire. So in this metaphor, we're actually burning with the fire of greed and hatred and delusion. And this is what causes our unhappiness, and this is what causes our stress. And there's actually no need for blame around that. We're just confused. And the task is just to get unconfused. And if we're craving, and we're just wishing things were different, then we're resisting reality. And as long as we resist reality, the fires keep burning. So before I go any further into Buddhist teachings about clinging and non-clinging, I just want to make it absolutely clear. This isn't about becoming self-righteous about our desires. And it certainly isn't about becoming repressed or neurotic about them. It's about balance. It's about openness and kindness towards ourselves. And it's about accepting that we're subject to reactive patterns of mind. It's just a reality. It's just true of all of us. So if you're feeling glum because it's raining, that's fine. There's no need to actually add any additional layers of suffering. The task is simply to know when habits of clinging and reactivity are happening, when they're operative and when they're not. So there's actually 4 types of clinging in Buddhist teachings, 4 types of reactivity. And the first one is clinging to sense objects. And this is about the way that we chase after sensory experiences that we perceive as pleasant. And we push away the ones that we think are unpleasant, like wet weather, for example. And it doesn't mean that we shouldn't be open to our senses. It's just that a lot of the time we're not fully experiencing what's happening in front of us. And instead we're just experiencing our reaction to whatever's happening in front of us or whatever we're remembering or thinking about in the future. So it's that constant pushing and pulling that says, I want more of this and I want less of that. That's what's causing us discomfort. That's what's causing us suffering. And the second type of clinging is clinging to opinions and views. And most of our arguments with other people are because we cling to our opinions. And we get angry because not everybody is as smart as us, so their worldview is wrong and they don't agree with us. And this can grow into a whole storm of self-righteousness and hostility. And that's how wars start. And it's not to say that all views are equally valid or that we shouldn't, that we should just believe anything. Clinging to opinions and views is about being stuck, being trapped in a place where there's no movement, no potential to learn or grow. And then the third one is clinging to rites and rituals. And this was a big thing at the time of the Buddha. It was a huge source of disputes because there were so many competing religious factions with their own rituals, their own practices. And I know it's different now in a way, but we do have our modern equivalents. We do have our sacred symbols. And there's many things that feel really very important to us, even though they're really just habits of mind. They're just rituals, really. And most of us want our lives to be arranged in a particular way. And as meditators, we can become absolutely obsessed with recreating perfect conditions for our practice. So in a sense, that's also clinging to rites and rituals. And then finally, the big one is clinging to a sense of self. Because the view of self is the primary base of all forms of clinging, all forms of reactivity. So actually other forms of clinging are really just offshoots of this one. So when you find yourself suffering, you can often trace it back to whatever view of yourself is being clung to at that moment. So whenever we're caught up in repetitive thinking, usually means we're striving to create and recreate and protect our sense of self, which isn't actually necessary. And actually it's pretty much impossible. So this self-construct requires a lot of maintenance. It becomes a huge investment of our energy. And the investment of the energy is the upadana. That's the clinging, that's the grasping, that's the reactivity. And it's exhausting and it doesn't work. And most, or maybe all of our suffering comes from experiences that are universal. And the problem is that we take them personally. And we create identities to try and avoid them. And we just argue with the world, we argue with reality. So how do we actually start to address this? How do we start to address this habit of reacting? Where do we start? We can obviously practice with something easy like the weather. But then when somebody criticizes us and we get defensive, it's a whole lot harder. That's another level of challenge. But it's also where the real growth happens. So no matter how hard we try to be perfect, we're going to get things wrong. Someone is going to criticize us. And the secret, of course, is not to be perfect. The secret is to be aware of the patterns of clinging and reactivity that actually come up in all of us. Come up whenever the ego is threatened. And whenever we feel like we have to bolster our sense of self. So those reactive patterns of mind, they're biological, they're very natural. But here's the thing. In the midst of your reactivity, there can be non-reactivity. So as you feel yourself tightening up, you can allow that feeling to arise and pass just by itself. And accept it coming and accept it going. And this is a skill that takes practice. And you need to be willing to do the work. You need to be willing to go through what you need to go through in order to develop that skill. And the teacher, Pema Chodron, uses the metaphor of scabies to describe our reactivity. It's as if we've got this sore and we keep scratching it. We really just want to scratch it. And even though we know that scratching only gives us temporary relief, it ends up making it worse. We keep doing it. And it's about if we could learn to go through the discomfort without scratching. Eventually the sore heals, gets better. And we just need to be aware of the clinging and the reactivity as it arises. So when we experience really strong negative feeling or emotion, we can ask ourselves questions, like what's actually being grasped at right now? What's got me hooked? What am I actually trying to soothe by scratching it? Maybe what is it I'm trying to identify with? And another thing we can do is actually to look and notice, and maybe even investigate moments when we're not clinging to things, moments of not suffering, where there's no real construction of a view of ourselves. What does that feel like? Is there any sense of relief or release? So what's needed here is just some care, some curiosity, some investigation, but especially curiosity, just gentle curiosity. Because if we're interested in something, then it's very easy to learn. If there's no curiosity, it's hard work. Curiosity is what stops meditation from being boring. We need questions, we need some uncertainty. And rather than just trying to manage and control our experience, how about just experiencing it and noticing what that feels like? Just sitting there and asking, what's happening now and what's happening now? Is there struggle or is there peace? Am I resisting or am I just riding the waves? Whatever the answer is, don't give yourself a hard time. At the moment, for now, it's enough just to know. So that's everything I want to say this week, really. And I hope you can join me again sometime soon on Kitchen Sink Dharma.